Hello everyone, my name is BentonReed and welcome to another speed draw video. Today's video is actually going to be a speed model video. That's right, we're going to be jumping into Blender for some 3D modeling action. I'm really excited. I've been doing a lot of Blender and I haven't actually sat down and made a time-lapse of one before, so this will be some new content on the channel. Before we begin, I just want to say I stream Blender and digital art and all kinds of other things over my Twitch, including the process of making this piece. So if you like what you see in the video and you want a better look at the process, a more in-depth look at the process, go follow me over there at twitch.tv/TheBentonReed. Without further ado, let's jump in. So today's model is going to be kind of loosely based on the aesthetic of Fallout. It was definitely what was playing most in my brain when I was making it, but I kind of had this idea of an underground secret reactor base bunker thing, and I really like this piece because I think it represents a big growth for me in the way that I use Blender and the things that I know how to do. I used geometry nodes for the first time. I finally figured out how to use the skin modifier somewhat. You'll see me mess with it and mess it up a couple times, but start learning how to use it. And I'm really happy with how the final piece turned out. It has a lot of atmosphere. It has a lot of different techniques and materials in it that I think I did a pretty good job with, and I'm pretty proud of it. So you can see I'm just kind of blocking in the main reactor structure here. I had this sketch in my head of a kind of round reactor suspended in a kind of glass enclosure. So I'm just building the sphere using some geometry nodes to give it kind of a different texture on the surface. And then I start building these pylons out the top that I'm going to give some emission a little while later in the process when we start to get to materials. But it's all pretty simple shapes, pretty simple modeling. It's nothing really too fancy. I think it's the composition that is the thing that I feel like I really took a step forward with, and some of the material techniques that I used. You can see me shaping in those wraparound glow rings that'll glow later, and just using different modifiers to kind of smooth them out and round them up so that they look like little donuts stacked on top of the thing. And just spreading things out, adding these details to the center orb, playing with a few different things. I wanted to kind of give it some bolts, so you can see me struggling to remember how to get the geometry nodes to do what I want them to do, but I eventually get it where I have little bolts, little round head bolts on each of the little points, little triangle points. And I modify the base so that I can have some wires running down into the center. I do my kind of typical RGB wires that I use in a lot of my stuff. I don't think they're visible at all in the final composition, but sometimes that happens when you're 3D modeling. You know, you build some stuff and then you change your mind on what the camera position is going to be, and all of a sudden, it doesn't matter anymore because you can't see it. So you can actually see me here go in and kind of set up the rough camera position kind of roughly how I want it, so I know how much detail I need to put into things and how scaled things need to be. I add this glass bar enclosure around the outside, and then I start working on a little circular walkway. I'm using a lot of skin modifiers, a lot of wireframe modifiers, which are things that I'm slowly starting to get more comfortable with to create these railings and support structures. It's just a lot faster way of doing it. I throw that little cube in there to give me a rough scale of how big a person I think would be. I'm not working in true scale. I'm being bad, and I'm not working in a pure scale, but I'm working as close as I can to what feels like a pure scale. And yeah, it's just a lot of modeling, a lot of different shapes and structures. I'm working on a kind of computer bay right now that I'm going to end up using in full radial symmetry around the entire thing. It's another piece. I mean, I'm really happy with how the whole thing turned out, so I feel like I could keep saying that I'm really happy with how this particular bit turned out, but I am, again, you know, I used a lot of new things that I've been picking up as I've continued to learn Blender, because I still am very much a beginner in Blender. And so sometimes you kind of get in your head and you're like, I haven't really progressed that much. You know, I'm still kind of stuck where I started out. I'm not learning anything. And then you sit down and you make something that you never could have made a couple months ago. And, you know, I think especially this took me maybe 2 to 3 hours, maybe 3 hours. And just being able to do the whole thing from scratch in 3 hours, even if the overall, like, impressiveness of it isn't necessarily that much higher, it would have taken me 8 hours to do this a few months ago. And so that's another part that I'm really, really happy with. And you see me jump into materials here, playing with the glass. I want something that's a little bit frosted, a little bit crackly, definitely a little bit kind of grimy and worn. So I'm using some noise maps on the roughness to kind of create that look. And then I start working on this metal material that I try to give a nice crusty, rusty, musty, dusty feel. And really just playing with things, making sure things are going in the right direction, getting all of the noise maps and color ramps to line up, so that when you see the actual structure, it looks like somewhat rough iron that's being eaten away or having rust built up on top of it. And yeah, we're pretty much fully in the materials phase of the process now. I think there's a couple of things that I have left to model that I changed my mind on later, but for now, it's all materials, and so I wanted the reactor to look like it had been painted, but it had metal underneath, and that metal was rusting away. And so it's kind of just the same process, using color ramps on a noise texture, rather, to really get that look that I'm going for, get a kind of coppery electrical element feature. I do think that I end up changing the reactor to a slightly less saturated color. I go to a greenish tealish tint, but not quite as bright. Adding the emission onto those rings and onto the tops of each of those pylons, just to get that not natural, but ambient lighting, to get some rough ambient lighting. And I start, touching up on some modeling things, throwing some of the textures and materials that I've already made onto other things, both to save time and to kind of create a feeling of closeness, of harmony, that all these things are kind of made by the same hands in some of the same materials, but rough little tweaks. So like the base isn't quite as rusty, it's a little bit rougher, and there's a couple of different tweaks between the different types of metal, the different types of painted metals, little things that add a little bit of a bonus. And then I actually use a Voronoi texture, which is probably not the way to do it. I think looking at it now, I probably could have just used a brick texture squared up to make a checkerboard. But I end up using a Voronoi texture to create this kind of metal paneled floor. I play with it for a long time, trying to get the look that I like, get it in a way that I think reads. And again, I think it would have been easier to just use a brick texture, but for whatever reason I said, no, I'm going to use a Voronoi texture for this. I'm not going to use a brick texture, I'm not going to take the easy way out, I'm going to use a Voronoi texture for this. And you can see here's where I changed my mind about the camera angle. I want to get a little bit closer, get a little bit more detail, and a little bit less of the detail of the circular railing, the circular floor, because I just don't think it's working very well. So you can see me kind of doing a test render here, just to get a rough feel. This is something that I do a lot when I'm working. If you follow me on Twitch, you'll see I like to do short little test renders. Half the time I don't even let them finish, but there are certain things that you only really see, at least in my brain, in my eyes, that you only really see when you do a test render out. Things that slip by you when you're looking at it in a material preview, or even when you're looking at it in a rendered preview. There's just things that slip by you. And I kind of decided I need to change some materials, I need to work on some materials, and I liked the composition that I had, which I think was the main purpose of that material, that test render. Just to see how I liked the composition, what I felt the composition needed, and how much of this I needed to render and how detailed, which is the other nice thing about test rendering and setting your camera angle early on, at least for static modeling and static shots. You know how much work you need to do pretty quickly. So I'm using the painted metal as a base, but replacing it with a kind of painted sandstony concrete. So there's places where the paint has started to chip away, revealing the concrete structure underneath. It's another material that I'm pretty happy with, even though you cannot see a single bit of detail on it on the final piece, which, again, it happens. Sometimes you make something and then you look at the final render and you're like, not only is that in the dark, it's being blocked and distorted by very rough glass, so glad I spent 30 minutes on that. But that's the nature of the beast with 3D modeling and things like Blender. And yeah, finishing up some materials on these consoles, adding a little bit of emission so that they look like they're computer screens that are really glowing. If I could see the facing of any of these screens, I probably would have done a little bit more work putting an image texture on there so that it would really have like some text to it, but they're all off camera. All I need is that ambient lighting coming off of them. Anything else is extra work that doesn't really need to be done. It adds something that no one other than me would even notice. And here's the final little bit that gets modeled. I decide that I need a little bit more lighting. It's a little too dark. It doesn't really make sense. And so I decide to make a little wall light, a little kind of cage industrial wall light. And you can see I just kind of come up with it here. I like this diamond pattern that I just kind of come across in the modeling. And I choose to use that, but it's another detail that you really can't tell looks like that from a distance. Which is part of the reason why I leave it rounded, because I'm like, it's so small that it's going to look exactly the same. And it has that kind of expanded steel look to it, even with the slight rounding of the corners. It's actually slightly more true to expanded steel. And so I just add these in array all the way around the side of the room, just to create little points. They really don't bleed that much. Their emission's not that strong, but they create little points, and especially once I add volumetrics in just a little bit, you'll see how much of a difference it makes. Which brings me to the volumetrics, because I haven't done them yet. And typically I would have added volumetrics before this point, but for whatever reason I was having such a good time with everything else, and it was looking so good to me that I hadn't felt the need to yet, which is rare. But it's time. It's time for volumetrics. It's always time for volumetrics. I swear, learning how to use volumetrics, learning how to use fogs and that kind of thing, even just at the most basic level, took my Blender works so much higher. I look at the things that I made without any volumetrics in them, and they look so flat and boring. And even when they're well modeled, they look flat and boring. And now, I can create really simple stuff, add some fog, and my little lighting designer brain can go crazy with the lighting, and you can really see it. And it works a lot better, and it looks a lot better. And you can see me there, I just tried to add some red lights around the edge with geometry nodes, and I could not get it to work the way I wanted to. And so I was like, fuck it, it's a small detail. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to deal with it. It wasn't really worth trying. You can kind of see it a little bit in the top left there as I'm test rendering, but it really wasn't worth it. It wasn't enough of an effect to be worth it. I did add depth of field, which is something that I definitely like in this piece, having that blurry foreground and a little bit of blur in the background. Depth of field in Blender is a little touchy. It may just be that I don't know what I'm doing with it, which I fully admit is a high possibility, but it gets a little touchy. Sometimes I can get it to do what I want to in terms of shallowness and shallowness of focus. Sometimes I can't. And there you have it. That's my little underground reactor piece, somewhat inspired by Fallout. I was playing a lot of Fallout, specifically Fallout 4 when I was making this, and watching the show more times than I would like to admit. It really hooked me. It really brought it in. So even though this isn't directly a Fallout fan piece necessarily, it's not directly trying to mimic or copy anything from the actual series. It is very much inspired by the aesthetic, and I encourage you to go play some Fallout because, goddamn, hashtag not sponsored. The games are good. The show's good. It's good. It just works. To quote Todd Howard, it just works. So, that's all for today. Once again, go follow me on Twitch if you want to see more of my process, or if you want to see me be bad at video games, because I do that too. And I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.